The great Senate Hall of the Galactic Concord stretched for miles in every direction, its curved walls made of living crystal that hummed with ancient power. And within this massive chamber, representatives from over 300 species had gathered to witness something they found deeply amusing. Humanity had come to ask for membership. Ambassador David Chun stood at the central podium, a tiny figure surrounded by beings that towered over him, beings that glowed with internal light, beings that existed as clouds of conscious gas, beings that had traveled between stars when human ancestors were still learning to walk upright. And he felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him like a physical force. The Solani delegation sat in the highest tier, their crystalline bodies catching the light and throwing rainbows across the chamber. And their leader, a being called Kethver, watched a human with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been contempt. The species known as humanity, the Concord speaker announced, its voice echoing through translation devices in 100 different languages, has formally petitioned for full membership in the Galactic Concord. And we shall now hear their representative speak. David cleared his throat and began his prepared speech, talking about human achievements, about their journey from primitive caves to the stars, about their hopes for peaceful cooperation and mutual benefit. And as he spoke, he could hear the whispers spreading through the chamber like wind through dead leaves. The Marathi delegation, shapeless beings of pure energy, flickered with what their translators rendered as laughter, and the insectoid cricks clicked their mandibles in a pattern that meant mockery. And even the usually stoic Ven, massive silicon-based creatures who rarely showed emotion, seemed to vibrate with amusement when David finished speaking. The silence lasted only a moment before Kethver rose to respond. "We have reviewed the human submission with great care," the Solani said, and his voice rang through the chamber like struck crystal. "And we find it most entertaining." The word hung in the air, and David felt his face grow hot. Humanity achieved faster than light travel only 43 of their years ago. Kethver continued, "And in that time, they have established exactly 12 colonies, built a defense fleet of approximately 40 combat vessels, and developed weapons technology that our ancestors abandoned as primitive over 8,000 years passed." He paused and looked directly at David with eyes that swirled like galaxies. The Solani were building empires when humans were painting animals on cave walls. And the Marathi had mapped every star in this galaxy before humans discovered fire. And the Ven had achieved immortality before the first human city rose from the mud. The laughter was open now, rolling through the chamber in waves. "We do not say this to be cruel," Kethver added, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but merely to provide context, for the Concord has standards that must be maintained, and humanity, while showing some promise, does not yet meet those standards." The vote was quick and unanimous, and humanity was granted observer status, which meant they could attend sessions but not vote, could trade but only with approved partners, could colonize but only in regions deemed worthless by full members. David returned to Earth with the news, and the world leaders who had sent him received it with quiet fury. But there was nothing to be done, for humanity was small and weak and alone in a galaxy that had no patience for newcomers. But not everyone accepted defeat. Admiral Sarah Chun, commander of Earth's Orbital Defense Network, watched the Senate recording in her private quarters aboard the station called Prometheus, and her face showed no expression as Kethver delivered his mockery. But her eyes were cold and calculating when the recording ended. She turned to her second-in-command, a man named Torres, who had served with her for 20 years. "How long until the Spectre prototypes are ready for field testing?" she asked. Torres checked his datapad and smiled grimly. 6 months, Admiral. "And we have 12 hulls in various stages of completion." Sarah nodded and pulled up a classified file on her screen, one that required 3 separate authentication codes and a biometric scan to access. And the words Spectre Protocol glowed in red letters at the top. "Push the timeline," she said quietly, And I want 20 operational units within 18 months. Torres raised an eyebrow, but did not question her. The Concorde thinks we are primitive. Sarah continued, as she stood and walked to the viewport where Earth hung blue and beautiful against the black. And they think we are weak, and they think we are beneath their notice. She turned back to Torres with something dangerous in her eyes. Let them keep thinking that. On the Solani homeworld, Kethver celebrated the day's events with his aide, a younger crystal being named Velthan, who had watched the human ambassador with more attention than his superior. Did you see his face when you spoke? Velthan asked, for I thought he might shatter with shame. Kethver made a sound like wind chimes in a storm, the Solani equivalent of dismissive laughter. They breed like parasites and die like mayflies, he said, and their entire species has existed for less time than I have held my current position. So give them 1,000 years, and perhaps they will learn something worth knowing. Velthan nodded but said nothing, for something about the human had bothered him. Something in the way the small creature had stood alone before the mockery of 300 species without flinching. Something in the steadiness of his voice, even as the laughter washed over him. It was not the bearing of a defeated people, Velthan thought, but rather the patience of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. But he kept this observation to himself, for Kethver would not have listened, and besides, what could humans possibly do against the combined might of the Galactic Concorde? They were just primitives after all, just insects playing at civilization, while the true powers of the galaxy looked down and laughed, and that was exactly what humanity wanted them to believe. 3 years passed after the mockery in the Senate Hall, and humanity learned to swallow its pride and play the role the Concorde had assigned to it human. Delegates attended every session and sat in the back rows where observers were permitted. And they took notes and asked polite questions and pretended not to notice when other species talked about them, as if they were not their human. Merchants tried to establish trade routes, only to find their applications denied or lost or delayed indefinitely. And human colonists attempted to settle new worlds, only to discover that every habitable planet had already been claimed by species that had never even visited them, and through it all, the Concorde watched with amused tolerance, like adults watching children play at being important. Then came the incident at Kepler 442, a fleet of Solani merchant vessels entered a system that humanity had been exploring for 2 years. A system with a moon rich in rare minerals that human scientists had just begun to survey, and without any warning or negotiation, the Solani ships began strip mining operations that would leave the moon a hollow shell within months. Ambassador David Chun filed a formal complaint, citing Concorde regulations about territorial claims and resource rights. And the response came 3 weeks later in the form of a brief message stating that the complaint had been reviewed and dismissed due to insufficient standing. Humanity was not a full member, the message explained, and therefore had no territorial rights to defend. David stood before the Senate once more, this time not asking for membership but demanding justice. And once more, Kethver rose to respond with that same crystalline voice full of barely hidden contempt. The humans have brought this matter before us repeatedly, Kethver said. And repeatedly, we have explained that observer species do not possess the same protections as full members. So perhaps, if humanity spent less time complaining and more time developing their primitive technology, they might one day earn the rights they now demand. The laughter came again, and David returned to Earth with nothing but the humiliation. At Kepler 442 was only the beginning. 6 months later, sensors at the edge of human space detected something that made every military commander on Earth go cold with fear. The Vreth had come. Vreth were not members of the Concorde, for even the ancient and powerful species of the Alliance wanted nothing to do with them, and their reputation stretched across the galaxy like a shadow. They were reavers, nomads, destroyers, and they traveled in a massive armada that had been growing for 10,000 years. absorbing the ships and technology of every civilization they consumed. And the number of species they had wiped from existence numbered 17, with countless others reduced to scattered refugees. The Concord had dealt with the Vreth in the only way that seemed to work, by paying them tribute in the form of resources and technology and occasionally territory. And for centuries, this arrangement had kept the Reavers at a distance. But now the Vreth wanted more, their warlord, a massive insectoid creature named Scarx, who had led the Armada for 300 years, sent a message to the Concord with simple demands. And those demands included the outer territories of Concord space, along with everything in them, including Earth. The emergency session of the Senate was brief and brutal. The Vreth demand is clear, the Concord speaker announced, and they have specified that the human territories fall within their requested acquisition zone. David Chun stood once more at the podium, this time not asking but begging. "You cannot do this," he said, and his voice cracked with desperation. "For we are a civilization of 12 billion people, and we have done nothing to deserve annihilation." Cathver's response was delivered without a moment of hesitation. "Humanity is not a full member of the Concord," he said, "and therefore their space is not technically Concord territory, which means their inclusion in the Vreth demands does not constitute an attack on the Alliance." He paused and looked around the chamber at the other delegates, many of whom could not meet his gaze. The Concord's position is that human space is negotiable. The vote passed with only 3 abstentions, and humanity was officially abandoned. David sent word to Earth, and Admiral Sarah Chun received it aboard the Prometheus with a face like carved stone. "How many Vreth ships?" she asked Torres. 800 confirmed warships, Admiral, plus support vessels, and they are already moving toward our border. Sarah nodded slowly and turned to face her command staff, officers who had spent 3 years preparing for this moment while hoping it would never come. "Send the recall order to all Spectre units," she said quietly, "and tell them Phase 1 is complete." Torres frowned in confusion. "Phase 1. Admiral Sarah allowed herself a small, cold smile. "For 3 years we have played the fool," she said, "and we have swallowed every insult and accepted every humiliation. And we have let the galaxy believe that humanity was exactly what they thought we were." She pulled up a tactical display showing the positions of 200 green dots scattered across Concord space, dots that no Concord sensor had ever detected. "Now they send monsters to destroy us, believing we cannot fight back, believing we have nothing but 40 outdated ships and a dozen defense stations." Her smile grew wider and colder. "Let them keep believing that until the very last moment." The Vreth Armada entered human space like a plague of locusts descending on a field of wheat. And Warlord Scarx stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Devourer, watching the tactical display with all 4 of his compound eyes. 800 warships stretched out behind him in a formation that had crushed 17 civilizations, and each vessel bristled with weapons taken from the corpses of dead species. And the crews that manned them had never known defeat. Scarx had received intelligence reports about humanity from Concord sources, reports that described a primitive species with laughable technology and no real military capability. And he had almost felt disappointed that this conquest would provide no challenge. "Warlord," his sensor officer clicked, "we are detecting human vessels falling back toward their homeworld." Scarx watched as the handful of blue dots on his display retreated before his advancing fleet, and he made a sound that passed for laughter among the Vreth. "They run without even attempting to fight," he said. "And perhaps this species will not even be worth consuming." The Concord had sent observers to accompany the Vreth fleet, officially to document the transfer of territory, but really to ensure that the Reavers did not exceed their agreed boundaries. And these observers sent regular reports back to their governments describing humanity's apparent surrender. Kether received these reports in his chambers on the Solani homeworld, and felt something that might have been pity. They simply gave up. Velthan said as he reviewed the latest transmission, and their ships are gathering near the third planet without any attempt at organized defense. What did you expect? Kethver replied, for they are primitives facing the most feared armada in the galaxy, and even they must recognize that resistance would be futile. He turned away from the display and dismissed the matter from his mind. For humanity would soon be nothing more than a footnote in galactic history. Another failed species that rose too fast and fell too hard. But something strange was happening in the darkness between stars. The Vreth fleet passed the outer planets of the human system, moving in perfect formation through the asteroid belt. And Scarix was already planning how he would divide the conquered territory among his subordinates when his censor officer made a sound of confusion. Warlord, we have lost contact with the destroyer Vreegthan. Scarix turned his massive head toward the display, where one of the blue dots representing his ships had simply vanished. Explain. I cannot explain. Warlord, for there was no distress signal and no energy discharge. And one moment the ship was there, and the next it was gone. Scarix felt the first tiny stirring of unease, but dismissed it as a malfunction or an accident. For the void of space held many dangers, and even Vreth ships could fall victim to them. Then, another ship disappeared, and another within 6 hours. 47 Vreth vessels had simply ceased to exist, and there was no explanation for any of them. No weapon signatures, no debris fields, no final transmissions. Nothing but silence where warships had been. Scarix ordered his fleet to full alert and demanded answers from his officers. But no answers came, and the disappearances continued with terrible regularity on the bridge of the cruiser Fang. Captain Vrexenar was shouting orders to his crew when the hull beside him suddenly opened like a wound, and the air screamed out into the void. And he had just enough time to see something sleek and dark pass by the breach before the cold took him on the battleship Crusher. The engineering section simply ceased to exist, carved away from the rest of the ship by something that left edges so clean they looked almost surgical. And the vessel broke apart in silence on transport after transport. Crew compartments vented into space through holes that appeared without warning. And soldiers who had conquered worlds died gasping in the dark without ever seeing their enemy. The Concord observers watched in growing horror as the Vreth fleet began to come apart. And their reports became increasingly frantic. Something is hunting them, one observer transmitted, but our sensors detect nothing. And the Vreth cannot find the source of the attacks. Cathfall received this report and felt the first cold touch of fear. How is this possible? He demanded. For our sensors are the most advanced in the galaxy, and if we cannot detect this threat, then what could possibly be causing it? Velthan had no answer, and neither did anyone else in the darkness of human space. Warlord Scarix finally did something he had never done in 300 years of conquest. Ordered his fleet to stop the Vreth armada hung motionless among the outer planets, surrounded by the wreckage of their own vessels. And for the first time in his long and bloody career, Scarix tasted fear. Something was out there in the black, something that could kill without being seen, something that was hunting the hunters, and it was not finished yet. What the Vreth did not understand, what the Concord had never suspected, what the entire galaxy had failed to see, was that humanity had taken a very different path to the stars. Every other species in known space had followed the same basic pattern of development, building bigger engines and stronger shields and more powerful weapons, racing to see who could create the most impressive displays of force. And the Concord measured advancement by the size of ships and the brightness of energy signatures. Humans had looked at this approach and asked a simple question: what if they never see us coming? The answer to that question was the Spectre program, a project so secret that fewer than 100 humans knew it existed. a project that had consumed more resources than every other military program combined. A project that represented everything humanity had learned about survival in a hostile universe. The Spectre-class warship was not large, measuring only 300 meters from bow to stern. And it carried no shields, because shields generated energy signatures that could be detected instead. The hull was covered in adaptive metamaterial plates that could bend every form of radiation around the ship, making it invisible to sensors, invisible to eyes, invisible to everything the galaxy used to see. The engines produced no heat signature, because they converted energy with perfect efficiency, leaving nothing behind to betray their presence. And the weapons were designed to fire once and relocate before the light from the shot reached the target for 3 years. 200 of these ships had been watching and waiting, scattered across Concord space, gathering intelligence, learning weaknesses, preparing for the day when humanity would need them. That day had come. Admiral Sarah Chun stood on the bridge of the Prometheus, watching the tactical display as her Spectre fleet moved through the Vreth Armada like ghosts through a graveyard. And she felt no joy in the killing, only a cold determination to protect her people. Admiral, Taurus reported, Warlord Scarx has ordered his fleet to halt, and he appears to be waiting for something. Sarah nodded and opened a communication channel. Audio only, broadcasting on all Vreth frequencies. Warlord Scarx, she said, and her voice was calm and steady. This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the United Earth Navy, and I am offering you one chance to survive this day on the bridge of the Devourer. Scarx heard the human voice and felt his rage building, for no prey had ever spoken to him with such audacity. You offer me survival, he roared back. When I have 800 warships, and you have nothing but tricks and shadows. I have 200 warships that your sensors cannot detect, Sarah replied. And I have already destroyed 47 of your vessels without losing a single one of my own. So I suggest you consider your position very carefully. Scarx made his decision in an instant, for he had not conquered 17 civilizations by showing weakness. And he gave the order to fire everything in every direction. The Vreth fleet erupted in a storm of weapons fire. Plasma bolts and missile swarms and energy beams, tearing through space in a desperate attempt to hit something they could not see. And for a moment, the void itself seemed to burn, and then the Spectre fleet, the cloak had 200 warships, appeared out of nothing, materializing around the Vreth Armada in a perfect sphere of death. And they were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They were sleek and angular, painted in colors that seemed to shift and change, designed by engineers who understood that the best weapon was the one your enemy never knew existed. And they hung in space like predators, finally revealing themselves to their prey. Concord observers transmitted what they were seeing, and across the galaxy, beings who had laughed at humanity watched in stunned silence as the impossible became real. All ships, Sarah commanded. Weapons free. The battle lasted 9 minutes. The Spectre ships moved like dancers, appearing and disappearing, striking from angles that should have been impossible, coordinating with a precision that the Vreth had never encountered. And every shot they fired found its target because they had spent hours mapping every weakness in the enemy fleet. The Vreth fought back with everything they had, but they were swinging at shadows, and every time they thought they had a target locked, the target vanished and reappeared somewhere else. Warship after warship died in the darkness, and the wreckage spread across space like a field of broken dreams. And Scarx watched his armada disintegrate around him with something approaching disbelief on the Solani homeworld. Kethver stared at the transmission feed with eyes that had gone dark with shock. This is not possible, he whispered. For we scanned their systems and their ships and their technology, and there was nothing like this. Velthan stood beside him, watching the same feed. And he remembered his observation from 3 years ago about the human ambassador, who had not flinched before the mockery of 300 species. They let us see what they wanted us to see, Velthin said quietly, and we were so busy laughing that we never thought to look deeper. In the void around Earth, the last Wrath ships burned and died, and when it was over, only the Devourer remained, its weapons exhausted, its engines crippled, surrounded by 200 human warships that could destroy it at any moment. Sarah Chun opened the channel one final time. "Go home, Warlord," she said, "and take your survivors with you. And tell everyone what happened here today. And remember this moment when you think about returning." She paused and let the weight of her words sink in. Earth is not for you. The Galactic Concord Senate had never been so quiet. 300 species sat in their designated sections, their eyes and sensors and other perceptive organs fixed on the holographic display in the center of the chamber, watching recorded footage that had already spread to every corner of civilized space. The Battle of Sol, they were calling it. And it had changed everything. The footage showed Wrath warships being carved apart by weapons that left no trace, showed human vessels appearing and disappearing like ghosts, showed an armada that had terrorized the galaxy for 10,000 years being dismantled in 9 minutes. And when the footage ended, a human walked to the central podium. Ambassador Michael Chun was younger than his brother David, but he carried himself with the same quiet dignity. And when he looked up at the assembled delegates, there was no fear in his eyes and no pleading in his voice. "For 3 years," he began, "you laughed at us." The words hung in the air like a blade. "You dismissed us as primitives, as insects, as children playing at civilization. And when the Wrath came to destroy us, you sold us to them without a moment of hesitation, because our lives meant nothing to you." He paused and looked directly at Kethver, who sat frozen in his seat, and the whole time we were watching, Michael pulled up a star map on the central display, and 200 green dots appeared scattered across Concord space, marking the positions of specter ships that have been observing the great powers for years. "We learned your patrol routes and your communication codes and your sensor blind spots," Michael continued. "And we mapped your defenses and your weaknesses and your secrets, because we knew that one day we would need that knowledge to survive." The Marathi delegation flickered with alarm, and the Cricks clicked their mandibles in what might have been fear. And even the massive Vens seemed to shrink in their seats. "We are not asking for membership anymore," Michael said, and his voice was hard as iron, "because we no longer need your approval. And we no longer want your protection. And we no longer care about your ancient traditions and your petty hierarchies." He stepped forward, and though he was small and fragile compared to the beings around him, somehow he seemed to fill the entire chamber. "The Wrath tribute stops today. For we will not allow this Concord to continue feeding monsters in exchange for peace. And we will not stand by while innocent species are sacrificed to buy time. The illegal mining operations stop today. For every system that humanity has claimed is now protected by ships you cannot see and weapons you cannot stop. And from now on, when humanity speaks, the Concord listens." Kethver rose from his seat, his crystalline form trembling with barely suppressed outrage, and his voice rang through the chamber like shattered glass. "You would threaten the Concord," he demanded, "when we have 10,000 warships and the combined might of 300 species." Michael smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "You have 10,000 ships you can see," he said quietly. "And would you like to find out how many you cannot?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. The Concord speaker, an ancient being called Morath, who had guided the Alliance through 3 centuries of politics and war, finally raised one appendage and spoke. "The human representative makes a compelling argument," Morath said carefully. "And perhaps it is time for the Concord to reconsider its position on several matters." Kethver started to object, but Morath silenced him with a gesture. The motion to grant humanity full membership in the Galactic Concord is now open for discussion. There was no discussion, the vote passed unanimously, with even Kethfer raising his hand in favor. For he was many things, but he was not stupid. And he recognized when the balance of power had shifted 6 months later. Admiral Sarah Chun stood on the bridge of the newly commissioned flagship Prometheus, watching as a mixed fleet of human and Concord vessels assembled around her. Galaxy was changing. The Vreth had retreated to their distant territories and had not emerged since. And the other predator species that had long threatened the outer regions were suddenly very interested in peaceful negotiations. The tribute payments had ended, replaced by a mutual defense agreement that actually protected weaker species instead of sacrificing them. And for the first time in millennia, the smaller civilizations of the galaxy had someone willing to stand up for Thema communication arrived from the Outer Rim, carrying a desperate plea from a species called the Neth, who were fleeing something called the Swarm. And they were begging for any help the Concord could provide. The traditional Concord response would have been to form a committee and debate the matter for months. While the Neth died, Sarah had a different approach. This is the human battle group Mercies Edge, she transmitted, and we are on our way. So hold your position and do not lose hope. Velthan, who now served as the Solani liaison officer aboard the Prometheus, looked up from his console with concern. Admiral, the Concord has not yet approved intervention. Sarah smiled and turned to face him. The Concord will catch up, she said. For humanity does not wait for permission to do the right thing. She gave the order, and the fleet jumped to lightspeed, carrying 200 Spectre ships and 15 Concord vessels toward a battle that the old powers would have never fought. Because that was what humanity brought to the galaxy, not just invisible warships and impossible weapons, but the willingness to stand up for those who could not stand for themselves, and that, in the end, was worth more than all the technology in the universe. The stars blurred around them as they raced toward the unknown. And Sarah Chun looked out at the infinite darkness with eyes full of purpose. They had laughed at humanity once. No one was laughing anymore.